We're not talking about China or Vietnam. We're specifically talking about developing countries that suffer from some sets of characteristics that we think are definitive and they are significant for us to know. Think of example, a poor human development index in that country, defined by things like having little natural resources, very scarce economic infrastructure like roads, like lighting, like proper and continuous supply of electricity, water, or sometimes even food and medicine as well, where the state is inherently weak, even though they might not be politically weak, but may not have the economic or social largesse to provide welfare for each individual private citizen that exists in that country, and most importantly, Madam Speaker, that it suffers from chronic and massive unemployment. Right? We're talking about leaving people with the choice of either working somewhere for poor wages, for poor conditions, or not working at all, not eating at all, and suffering and dying on the streets. That is the necessary and big environment that faces citizens in countries like Bangladesh, and we think that it's fundamental importance that we recognize the importance of sweatshops with the context, with such big context in mind. Our policy is going to be simple. We're going to allow these people to establish workshops in certain areas. We might even help them establish workshops. We're not going to sanction them. We're going to continue to trade with these countries. We're going to continue to help them produce and allow them to continue manufacturing the products that they would like to specialize in. And slowly what happens is as they improve their economic conditions, as GDP growth slowly improves in these countries, we will correspondingly impose more regulations upon them as we see fit to bring the status or the level of regulation in that country up to parity with other normal standards we find in liberal democracies. What am I going to talk to you about today, Madam Speaker? I'm going to talk about a few things. Firstly, we're going to analyze the condition and definitive characteristics of workshops. This is of fundamental importance. Secondly, we're going to look at the economic benefits of sweatshops and why we think this is reason enough for us to recognize their importance with this brief context in mind. And third, we're going to argue and we're going to suggest to you how these sweatshops are a better option for human dignity vis-a-vis any other condition that they may necessarily face. So let's talk about what exactly sweatshops are. We think sweatshops are mini factories or mini industries that are primarily labor intensive, that sees the employment of people, particularly of a certain class, like for example the lower classes or the poor classes in the country, primarily maybe like single mothers in these societies, in these rural societies. We think they usually get low pay in the sense that it doesn't correspond to the kind of productive output that they produce in these countries. They don't usually have any form of significant medical benefits. Sometimes they don't have benefits at all. And what happens, and what's of primary importance, is that these people operate on low operating costs. The brutal reality as well, Madam Speaker, is that these sweatshops operate on very fundamental economic principles. Arguably principles that completely disregard human and social factors altogether and operate solitarily on the basis of profits and loss. Meaning that even though they may be harsh, they're not stupid. They still do what it takes to increase the profit margin for these people. And this is of fundamental importance as we go on to the second point, why economic benefits. We need to understand, and what we would suggest on this side is that sweatshops are of fundamental importance because it provides both short-term and long-term economic benefits. I know it sounds philosophically extremely simple, but I assure you it's not. What we're looking at here, with the introduction of both foreign companies and local companies who produce these sweatshops, who maintain these sweatshops, we think that these countries in question benefit quite a whole lot from only and purely from their introduction alone. Like for example, the Chinese companies that we see in Africa. Because with their introduction and keeping in mind that they work on very primary economic fundamentals of profits and loss, what they will do and what they usually do is that they establish economic infrastructure like roads to help them bring the goods that they produce to the ports or to the other areas where they need to be brought to for them to subsequently to be sold. We also think, for example, lightings imposed or built in these cities or in these villages to help facilitate the manufacturing production process of these sweatshops as well. Not primarily to benefit anyone in particular, but just to facilitate the production process and to get them the profits that they crave. Secondly, what we think is fundamentally important is that even though the sweatshops do blight like a huge majority of people, the poor and the lower classes that you find working intensively in these factories, we think there still exists some kind of transfer of skills to the middle management that is still required in these sweatshops. Even though it's particularly labor intensive and the plight that we are focusing on will be the women working those countless hours, people are still needed to still manage them all and ensure the operating processes are run smoothly. And the transfer of skills to these individuals is of fundamental importance because what usually and subsequently happens, as we see in Bangladesh, that the individuals who receive this kind of training and this kind of transfer of skills subsequently try and establish their own mini industries and try to make a living and breakthrough in that sense. Secondly, in the terms of long-term benefits, we think that is of fundamental importance as well. We need to understand one ineluctable reality when we're talking about sweatshops. It's an initial transition to greater and more industrialized growth in these countries. It never just exists and plateaus just in that particular state. But all economic countries, especially talking about developing countries, starts from one point, the initial point, and slowly progresses as economic prosperity trickles down to everybody in the society, from the owners of those manufacturing industries to the people working those countless hours in those sweatshops. And there are three primary things that you benefit from that we think is of importance here. Firstly, in terms of education, arguably they get very, very low pay in these industries. But what we cannot deny is that it empowers these families to at least send 1 out of maybe 10 children that they have to school. We make the concession, Madam Speaker, that combating poverty is not an easy job, that it is an intergenerational conflict. That we think that we need to, the only way we can combat poverty is to help the next generation get out of that particular vicious cycle. There's indeed very little that we can do for that particular class that's being blighted currently. And so what we think happens here is it allows for economic mobility for the subsequent generations, and we think this is important for them. Secondly, we think it also enables for the better improvements of standards in these factories in the long run as well. Because as these people get some form of economic mobility and economic empowerment, and as the lower middle classes slowly step up the ladder and burgeon in numbers, you will also be able to afflict and push through with the soft pressure to ensure that things, for example, unions are created, to ensure things, for example, better conditions are created as they get more economically prosperous, because they're able to exert that kind of economic pressures upon the people who actually hire them. And considering the nature, the state of these nations, when they have sweatshops, where they are quite nascent, where the pressures of corporations are still quite minimal, we think it's quite easy for them to establish such safeguards and such measures for these people. Thirdly, we think it also what happens here, from the perspective of people who own sweatshops, the natural incentive to move on from sweatshops to something larger and something more industrialized is a natural incentive as well. Arguably, these people want to earn lots of profits, and you're not going to get that from sweatshops alone. Because as your particular business grows and grows and grows, things like, for example, brand image, things like, for example, ensuring that your people are better skilled, making sure they get the right kind of people in, skilled labor in, to further increase your profit margin are the natural incentives that work on the owners of these sweatshops. So what naturally happens is that they move from the initial phase of sweatshops to something a lot more industrialized, something a lot more sophisticated, with the corollary benefits of safeguards and measures that are put in place. Now, the last point, why is this better for human dignity? We make the very simple suggestion here, madam, that even though people may make the choice to work for like 15 hours a day for very low pay, that is a choice that they inherently have. The only qualification that we can place on this is when there are no exit options available for these people. But what we argue here is that even though the options are quite bleak, there's a Hobson's choice for these individuals, arguably we suggest that an exit option remains nonetheless. The fact that they are able to make that option with full regard for the consequences is an important right that they should be given. Moreover, what we argue here is precisely because of the Hobson's choice, if they don't take up these jobs, what's going to happen is that they're going to fall under the informal sector, fall into things like, for example, criminal syndicates or racketeering, that most people in these countries usually find themselves falling under, and we think that's far more injurious to their human dignity and to their physical welfare as well. For these reasons, Madam Speaker, this important motion must stand.
Madam Speaker, all that is actually necessary in order to ensure continued employment in the developing world is admittedly not the same standards of conditions in the developed world, but is not the type of extremely abusive conditions that we see in sweatshops. We think that the mere existence of a problem does not justify its necessity and its continuation in today's debate. I'm going to look at two questions in rebuttal. Firstly, whether or not this is actually something that we could just throw our hands up and see change organically. Secondly, what this proposal does for development. So firstly, on whether or not this will ever change organically, because you heard a lot of analysis about how this was a system of labour that was absolutely terrible and underperforming in the way that it supported its workers. And yet you also heard a team that said they were more than willing to wait in the long term to see how this was going to change and that it would eventually be brought to parity. We have three responses to that. The first is that the reason why this problem of sweatshops is not changing is a collective action problem that is self-justifying. And we think the problem with that is that as soon as you recognise that it is necessary, you undermine any progress ever that could be made on reversing that collective action problem. That's something I'm going to analyse later in substantive as well. But secondly, we think that the other reason why it will never change organically is because the very type of primary economic manufacturing and textiles they wanted to talk about will always have a demand for them, and they will always exist as economies within those countries. So we simply can't say that they will just develop past that. Finally, we think that when they wanted to say that this will change organically because the middle class will just inspire liberalism and economic development all around the place, we think that that has a number of problems. The first is that the middle class that would develop under the affirmatives proposal would have such a disparity in experience with the people that they acknowledge were languishing in the more lower working positions in these industries that they would have absolutely no ability to empathise and want to draw those people out. Secondly, they conceded that this middle class would be the ones becoming the managers and the people running those industries. So the wealth of that middle class would be dependent upon the continued exploitation of that class. We don't think there was ever going to be an organic incentive for that middle class to encourage this type of development. So that brings me secondly to the idea about whether or not sweatshops actually lead to development. The first analysis that you heard on this was the foreign direct investment, that people come in and build infrastructure in order to facilitate this type of industry. We have two responses to that as well. The first is that we would say that even if we were able to, as we'll prove in our case that we can, raise labour standards, we think that the developing world markets will still be cheaper and that foreign direct investment will still be attracted to these countries, even if the cheapness that we're talking about doesn't extend to abusing the population. But secondly, the type of infrastructure that we see multinational corporations building, where they can transport their textiles to a port, is not particularly useful or one that should be championed in benefiting the vast majority of the population. It is a single-purpose road that is built only for the purpose of expanding that industry and for continuing that exploitation. Finally, on the idea of development, we heard the idea that this will happen through the middle class, through unionising and all of those sorts of things. I've pointed to you that we've told you that they have different lives. We don't think this middle class will have any incentive to change these conditions if they do indeed emerge. But finally, we heard even from the first affirmative himself that unemployment is so high in these areas that wages are kept low. We think that will always be the case under their proposal, and that the change has to come to the actual wages in today's debate, which is the position that the negative team is going to be taking. The proposal that we would stand by is the developing world committing to a principle of minimum standards within the labour market that did not include the inclusion of sweatshops. We think that this would be the commitment to the type of principle that we've seen on child labour taken by the developing world, and that has been quite effective in largely eradicating that process, in child labour processes. We'd be happy for WTO enforcement of these principles, and we would be happy for staggered principles to be enacted throughout the different standards of the developing world. I'm going to look at three issues in substantive. The first of those is why it is actually possible in today's debate to have labour standards. So as I flagged in my introduction, we don't think the existence of a problem actually speaks to its necessity. We think we have seen successful examples of regulation of labour standards by both the WTO and the United Nations. Those were child labour and the regulation of working with hazardous chemicals. These are analogous to this debate because they are things that have to be regulated within the labour force and across borders to start with. But secondly, they are analogous because this entails the government deciding and making a choice as to whether or not they're happy to see someone working in terrible, terrible conditions versus someone potentially not having a job. And what we're going to say is that it's not a legitimate trade-off to say that employment that is abusive and fundamentally harmful to that individual is actually worth their employment at all. But finally, the reason why we think that it is possible to have labour standards in this debate is because the type of race to the bottom that these guys wanted to justify is self-justifying and actually circular. And the only problem that we can point to is actually a collective action problem. So we think if we can propose a principle that is committed to and has international cooperation in the same way we have with child labour and hazardous chemical employment, we think that what we do is we get the type of cooperation that is required for this, and it means that the unemployment they pointed to will not happen because the companies that we are talking about will not have the option to go to a more lax regulating developing economy. So it is more possible for individual countries to take a stance on that because they're not going to lose the investment of that company because they won't just flee to a more lax market. Secondly, let's look at what this means for development. We think that we've seen countries individually, even though there is a collective action problem, remove and crack down on sweatshops. That's what we've seen in Indonesia. Let's look at what happened there. Firstly, there was somewhat of a rise in unemployment. But we think that is largely the result of Indonesia acting on their own. But we will concede there is a probable cause that there will be some unemployment. However, what we did also see was improvement in working conditions, obviously, but also, and more importantly, increased productivity within that workforce because they were not being forced to work long hours that they couldn't sustain, that made their workers ill and made them unproductive workers. What we think is that you can't say that this type of work is a necessity when it locks people in to a subsistence wage that means that they are locked into a static form of development. They have no ability to insert any type of discretionary funding into that economy. They have no ability to invest money or time in their own or their family's education, and that undermines any social mobility or ability to extract national or at an economic level development from those individuals. We think that's a problem for the development of these economies. It also speaks to the reason as to why this is not a problem that will organically go away. Finally, we think that this is not a form of employment that can be said to be necessary because of the type of human misery that this employment entails. And this was also characterised by the first affirmative speaker. But we think that when this is employment that leads people to have a nutritional deficit because they can't afford food and they have to burn energy in these labour-intensive services, when they can't unionise because these are illegal, when they can't work on human relations with their family because they don't have enough time off work, that is a type of human misery that the world can never say is justified as a form of employment. But the first affirmative wanted to tell you that they were the team that led for these people having more options. That's just not the case, because when this team says that this is a necessary form of employment, governments have to do nothing to support the unemployed or to support those people in their countries. We think that leaves them with less options and forces them into a form of labour we're not happy to recognise as appropriate, and we're most certainly not happy to recognise as legitimate in this debate.
These governments are doing nothing. If only it was as simple as that, Madam Speaker. The contention coming from that side of the House is we need to do more. These governments need to be doing more. Tell that to a sub-Saharan country which has a weak government that's unable to enforce the very type of standards that you are talking about, that needs to attract the kind of money that's required for upward mobility of its people, but cannot simply because these countries and the governments are weak, they lack infrastructure. What then is the solution? On the very first level, very first rebuttal, the principal stance coming up from that side of the House is we will not stand for brutality. There should not be a trade-off between having no job and having a job with bad conditions. They said that foreign developers will still be attracted to these countries simply because as long as it's cheap, people will come. Madam Speaker, let's face the reality. If I had to choose between China and a country in sub-Saharan Africa with equal standards, I would choose to go to China because at least the basic infrastructure is there. They're also enforcing minimum standards as well, Madam Speaker. Basic pay, they drag it down to the lowest possible number. So we think that if you go by your policy, the countries that would actually be able to run these sweatshops, the countries that actually would be attracting the possibility of sweatshops would lose out in this paradigm. On the second level, we think that no one wants to invest in a country that is dangerous. No one wants to go to sub-Saharan Africa, even if it's cheap, unless you can promise me that the amount of money I can make out of it is even more than I can if I do go to China, Madam Speaker. And that's the attractiveness of Africa. That's the attractiveness of a lot of these places that do run these sweatshops. On the second level, they then said, look, organic change is not possible because as long as you recognize the necessity of sweatshops, no change can be made. Well, that's not true. They brought up the example of Indonesia, and we bring you back the same example of Indonesia. The Suharto regime, Madam Speaker, sweatshops were prominent. They flourished because there's a recognition that sweatshops were essential in ensuring economic activity in the region. It's only after the stabilization of the masses, Madam Speaker, the fact that they were able to earn some form of economic sustenance, that did we manage to move away from sweatshops. Imran told you that if you empower them by giving them even that slight bit of money as compared to not having any at all, that's when you have adequate upward mobility. I'll be talking about that later in my substantive as well. On the second level, they then argued there will always be a demand for them. Or for goods, so that there will always be a need for shops. We don't really need sweatshops. The minimum standard would be adequate. When the demand grows, Madam Speaker, when the demand grows, we think a lot of the sweatshops will have to meet these growing demands, and that's where they will introduce these minimum standards, because that's where they have to employ more people. There's a recognition that in order to make sure that the masses who are working in your factories are happy, you would have to give them some form of development. And that's the kind of organic change that Imran was talking about. They then said that the middle class will have no empathy and they will not be able to change anything. Let's speak on the very first level. I think if people in first world countries can say sweatshops are bad, I'm pretty sure people in that very country can recognize that sweatshops are bad too. But the middle class is not the only people that will be pushing for change. We're also talking about the children of a lot of these sweatshop laborers, for example in India, who have pushed for greater standards, who have pushed for greater change. And this was only made possible because their parents were able to give them the kind of education required, because they had money from working from these sweatshops. On the third point of contention, Madam Speaker, they then talk to us about collective action. We should all enforce the same standards so that businesses have no option but to go to that, but to enforce minimum wage, for example, or basic healthcare standards. Well, if they were all the same standard, Madam Speaker, no one would be going to a lot of these places because they're weak governments, because there's very little security in those regions. We think that at the end of the day, if you really want to drive businesses out, that's the policy that you would take on. On the last level, Madam Speaker, they then came up to us and told us there's no point to a one-time investment. Sweatshops are temporary. They're just shacks with a single road. We think there's a value to that single road being built, Madam Speaker, because that road can be used repeatedly. We think there's a value when you allow people who originally would have no money whatsoever to get some form of sustenance, when you empower them with the use of that money, Madam Speaker, because that in itself is the point of that one-time investment. Well, the last level I promise this is my last level, Madam Speaker, they then told us, look, human misery is not justified because they can't find ways to use their money anyway. Madam Speaker, if my way of getting out of this misery is to be able to earn that few dollars so that I can give my child the education that I think is important, who are you to tell me that I'm being miserable? A lot of these people would prefer having jobs over none at all, Madam Speaker, and we think that is true alleviation or removal of human misery. We think sweatshops actually give them that option, something that Imran talked about that they didn't really respond to. So let's move on now to my substantive. How sweatshops are necessary in countries that don't provide a viable alternative. Madam Speaker, this is very related to the point on human misery. The question in these countries which are weak and which have almost non-existent economic infrastructure with no local economies or employment possibilities is this: where do these individuals go? These are societies that are more often than not involved or disenfranchised individuals caught in conflict-ridden societies. where many end up picking up guns, getting involved in tribal factions, Madam Speaker, getting involved in wars, getting employed by the Janjaweed, for example. There's great discontent, the lack of employability, and the presence of sweatshops, Madam Speaker, vastly changes that calculus. We say that at the end of the day, when you have sweatshops that provide the chance of gainful employment, that is when you make it significantly different from the status quo. That's when you change the calculus of a lot of these individuals from dropping their guns to picking up employment that gives them the prospect of some form of economic advancement. Madam Speaker, the small amount that you are referring to is significant to a lot of these individuals who in the past had no local industries to turn to, no economic opportunity to take on. So on the very first level, we think that that's important because it attracts people away from the violence and helps these individuals alleviate themselves from the poverty cycle. On the second level, we think it empowers the basis of society that's essential for mobilization. Imran's already talked to you about this. We think it's great if governments can give their people social welfare. But given that governments are weak, how then do we best propagate these, move these people forward? We think at the very first level, sweatshops economically distribute money on the lowest basis of society, and that's where true revolutions, that's where true change takes place. We think that the bottom-up change that you can get when you empower the base of society by giving them that little form of sustenance, Madam Speaker, is more important than simply saying the top, the weak top, should be allowed to change society, because we've seen how that failed repeatedly, Madam Speaker. From this perspective, real change is only possible, and this is evident in places like India, Madam Speaker, where you have great numbers of sweatshops, but a lot of these individuals manage to alleviate themselves or pick themselves up and make great changes for their friends and their family members who are also involved in the street. So at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, the real question in this debate is weak governments, people who need jobs, where do we go? We think sweatshops are the first step. They are necessary. We don't like them, but let's do it.
Second negative, please.
Madam Chair, the affirmative case that it would be easier to get development through employment and through investment in these countries in the immediate short term, they might increase like the factories that help exploit people. But what it hasn't addressed is the fact that if all these countries together demanded better wages, that they would be able to stop the subsistence level oppression of people in these factories and all insist on a better standard of living, in the same way that the WTO was able to when they insisted that child enslavement stop. So we are not going to let expediency rule when that is going to perpetuate these people's misery. Let's look at three things in rebuttal. Firstly, the long-term future of these states. Secondly, development. And thirdly, the second speaker's material. So firstly, the long-term development. And the first affirmative conceded that ultimately they wanted to bring the standards in these countries closer to parity with the standards everyone else enjoys. But if you concede that that is the ultimate goal, we would say that collective action can bring about that benefit in the immediate short term, not in the extreme long term. That why can't you do those things now if all countries insisted on better standards? Textiles will still be made in 50 years as they are now, but we think that we can insist on those conditions now. The next thing we heard from them in response to this was that the sweatshops was the only comparative advantage that these countries had. Because they were weak states, because they were bad and corrupt states, they needed this as a form of comparative advantage. We think if you concede that these sweatshops are only viable because they are positioned in the worst states, that you are creating no incentive for those states to change. That the governments are basing the employment of their citizens on having no standards at all, and those abusive labour standards will just be guaranteed to continue as a result of that, because you've said that's the only way that they can attract investment. Whereas we've told you that just like with child labour standards, that's not true. Second thing in rebuttal I want to look at is development. And what we heard from the first and second speaker was that they could increase people's education, because with your extra money from your job in a sweatshop, you'd be able to put one of your children through employment. But they said in their first speaker they were setting this debate to countries that had incredibly high unemployment. We think the problem with that is, in those countries with incredibly high unemployment, you could always just substitute someone for another worker, for someone else on the street. This drives the wage in those countries so low that there is no extra money for them to be putting into consumer goods or education. They can't lift themselves by the bootstraps out of poverty. Then we would also say, in terms of developing infrastructure, that because it's the international capitalist class that is building that infrastructure, they have an incentive to keep people poor. If they keep people poor in those countries, manufacturing wages will be very low and they will get consumer products cheaper, so they think. And so we think that their incentive is to build infrastructure only in a way that benefits them and not for the long-term benefit of the country where they're building it. That's why China may build a road out of a forest that they have ripped natural resources out of, but that infrastructure won't necessarily improve the conditions of the people in the labour market left behind in that country. Third issue I want to look at in rebuttal is before I move on to that, I want to look at unemployment. And we think that they've provided a largely false choice between being desperately poor in factories and being desperately poor and unemployed. Because as we've told you, if you overcome the collective action problem, if all countries act at the same time, we don't think that there will be any more unemployment because those factory jobs are going to have to go somewhere. But even if we concede that assuming but not conceding that the comparison was between being poor in a factory and being poor and unemployed, we would say it would be better to be unemployed because you don't suffer the degrading work conditions that put people's lives at risk when they lock factories and have people burn to death in them, or when they can consume more calories in working to maximum hours a day than they can actually afford to buy with their wage. We say that that is a degrading form of existence that is more harmful to them than merely unemployment. But that furthermore, the government has less incentive to improve the conditions of the unemployed when they can turn around to them and say that it's your fault. It's your fault for not lowering your own standards, putting your life at risk to work in a sweatshop, and that's the reason that you're unemployed. Last thing I want to look at is the second speaker's material. And she said that people would be forced to things like being soldiers or in crimes and racketeering, whereas this puts them in gainful employment. We think crime will still pay better because they're only going to get a dirt poor minimum wage in these sorts of factories. So we don't think that that's going to improve it. But that furthermore, we think that this undermines welfare because the basis for welfare is attacked when the government can say that unemployment is people's own fault, that they didn't lower their own standards more. So what am I going to tell you in substantive? Firstly, I'm going to tell you why this results in social conflict, and secondly, what this does for first world consumers. So firstly, to social conflict. And we think that societies where people work in sweatshops create extreme wage inequality. Because half the population are people that were previously subsistence farmers that have now become subsistence sweatshop workers with no possibility of personal advancement since they have no spare income for education. Whereas the other people in that society will be richer classes, landholders and factory owners, people that get richer directly at the expense of the poor, people who have an incentive to keep wages as low as possible because that's the basis of their wealth. What we think results from this is increased inequality, where the rich in these countries have very comfortable existences and the poor remain at a subsistence level of existence. What the result of this inequality is then social unrest. We think that it results in things like riots and things like crime, where people feel disenfranchised by the fact that although they work 16-hour days, although they are doing so much to try and improve their own material conditions, they can't get ahead, because if they ever wanted a higher wage sufficient to put one of their children through education, they would be sacked in favour of someone else. If they ever try and unionise, they would be sacked in favour of someone else. And although the affirmative has said that there's already high crime in these societies, we say that that crime is worse when you put sweatshops there, when people feel disenfranchised, when people feel that the state has abandoned them because they won't even enforce minimum standards, like arresting the factory owner who locks his workers into a factory, resulting in them burning to death when there's a factory fire. They feel disenfranchised and angry both at the capitalist class in their society and also at the state, and that results in more unrest and crime. The second argument I want to bring is about what this does to first world consumers. And we say there are some movements in the first world that recognise that there should be better basic minimum conditions of pay and work conditions, such as the fair trade movement. But most people justify their consumption and justify buying things from sweatshops on the basis of pure market logic that if someone is prepared to work for it, then it must be right. We think that that's not a good thing because they continue to buy consumer products that are only made cheap or are only possible to be made because of the oppressive conditions that they are made in. Our model changes that because it says that the fact that people are prepared to work for nothing is not a reason to then exploit them. And we've shown you that in the examples of the WTO cracking down against chemicals and cracking down against child labour. Where the same could be said there, that people were prepared to do those incredibly damaging things to themselves. But the fact of the matter is that they shouldn't have to. And the benefit that we think that this will have is that consumer choices will move ahead of those international minimum standards. But by setting that minimum standard, we will increase awareness, and people will be aware that just because someone is economically coerced into taking a job does not mean that it's good for them. So because we on the negative team think that nobody should have to work in conditions that are that poor, and if they move together, even the poorest states can have the same level of unemployment but better conditions, we beg to oppose.
There you go.
Thank you. Welcome to the side.
Now, Paul said that they wanted to maintain higher working standards in order to give the states the incentive to change, because otherwise they will have none. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not saying we're not going to push the states to have better government welfare, to take care of the people better. We will do all we can for that. The question we pose to them is, what if these states fail? Because we think poor governments has always been an endemic reality and will always be an endemic reality. And under these circumstances, their policy is effectively using human misery, the fact that these people cannot get jobs, cannot get welfare from the government, as a battering ram to force these governments to do better. We actually think that is unconscionable. So understanding that, I'm going to look at two things in this particular debate. The first issue is the urgent need for short-run economic gains and human dignity, and secondly, the issue of long-run economic development. So first and foremost, let's look at the issue of the short-run and issues of human dignity. Now, their solution here is to have international enforcement and collective action problem. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why collective action problems exist is because it dovetails with human nature. All it takes here is for one country to not adhere to the standards, and that is exactly where the MNCs will go. Especially since we're talking about places like Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where these countries are not on very friendly terms, and the likelihood of one country undermining another country by not adhering to standards is exceedingly high. So we are very sure that their policy will fail. But secondly, even if it succeeds, even if we use international standards, we don't think these standards are commensurate with the needs of local industry, for the simple reason that they're set by people like the WTO, where people like the United States have great preponderance of power. Therefore, the people setting standards are people like first world lobbyists, ladies and gentlemen, who fight for fair trade. And speaking of fair trade, the example used by the speaker before me, we think that is one example of how foreign standards are not suitable for local conditions. Fair trade coffee, ladies and gentlemen, instead of things like collective farms and high nice wages for a minority of coffee farmers throughout the third world, leaving the rest of the coffee farmers unemployed and dying in the streets, and effectively having their particular industry wiped out. We think that is harmful to local industries. Secondly, and it's a very interesting concession, they say, they want higher standards than the ones we suggest, but still lower than the first world, i.e. ladies and gentlemen, some standards in between. Firstly, we think there is already a concession that these countries require different standards for MNCs and FDI to help it. But secondly, they never dealt with our context, which is that these countries do not operate in a vacuum. They are competing, ladies and gentlemen, with nations like China, like Vietnam, like Brazil, who have a wealth of comparative advantages in terms of population, in terms of natural resources, in terms of already existing economic infrastructure through state-led action in the past, ladies and gentlemen. Under these circumstances, countries like Angola, like Bangladesh, like the Central African Republic have absolutely nothing, and they need some form of comparative advantage. And sadly, this is the only comparative advantage that they can offer them, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we think, because it is such a zero-sum game, that this will ensure that more people get employed, that more companies come in. And given the urgency of the situation, people die on the streets there, this particular volume is absolutely necessary. And this dovetails with their criticism of our infrastructure building as well. They say our infrastructure only serves a few people. Well, so does theirs, ladies and gentlemen. Theirs are also of a lower standard. They will attract less less MNCs, thus less infrastructure will be built. They need to show how their standards will lead to the kind of infrastructure that actually benefits the country more than we do. We say at least under our circumstances, these countries will get roads, will get ports, will get lighting, ladies and gentlemen, something they have never promised you in this particular debate. Surrounding this entire point is the issue of a trade-off. And the first speaker believably asserted that this trade-off is not worth it if some people get abused. On the first level, like we said, we are happy for these governments to do all they can. We may even help them through things like aid to ensure that they have welfare, to give to as many people as possible. What defines this government is their inability to reach out, their inability to tax, and their inability to give welfare. So after we have done all we can, and there's still a lot of people who are not helped, who are unemployed, who are dying, we want to give them this particular escape clause because they have no other choice. So in the event of government failure, the onus is on them to show us a particular alternative. Secondly, what exactly is the trade-off they are creating here? We think under their trade-off, we think a minimum people, the most employable working people in these countries may necessarily get a job in the few factories that are built, but the rest of them, ladies and gentlemen, will effectively be dying in the streets because they are less employable than the first particular job. We think in the third world, that is the trade-off we face, and we don't think it is fair. The one section of workers get privilege, get jobs, and the others have to die on the street. The third issue here is the issue of the alternatives, ladies and gentlemen, because in the absence of sweatshop jobs, these people don't just go anywhere, and they acknowledge this. Crime will still be rampant, racketeering will still be rampant, ladies and gentlemen. Human smuggling, like boat people, ladies and gentlemen, human smuggling, people smuggling to places like Australia will still be rampant. The only response to this was to say crime will still exist. No shit, we agree. But we think people who do not want to enter smuggling, who do not want to enter crime, will then have a choice of actual employment that is actually legitimate. And we think that is better for them because the abuse will be less. Especially since in Nimang's logic, he has already told you how companies have an inherent incentive to keep people alive, to feed them, to pay them, to ensure that they can actually work under sheer brutal economic logic. So ladies and gentlemen, we acknowledge that for the individuals on the ground, this is the Hobson's choice, but their choice is exceedingly worse for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. This brings me on to the second issue, the issue of long-term economic development. And the first thing they said is that our policy will create social conflict. That doesn't take into account the context of these countries right now. Because as of right now, the social inequality is even worse. They have a very small amount at the top of the pyramid, where the former feudal lords, for instance, the former chiefs, the former industrialists, or what have you, who are very, very rich, and everyone who is unemployed at the top are not even entrepreneurs who can actually provide them jobs. We think that is actually worse for social conflict, ladies and gentlemen, in the sense that less people work and more people will want to pick up guns to fight. And more importantly, they criticize our conception of the middle class. They say the middle class will be apathetic and they will not help the underclass. Firstly, we think there's a universal fact of all middle classes. They are always unable to empathize with the working classes at the start, even in Europe in the 1800s. We think it's through things like education, literature, the development of consciousness that they gain the empathy for the working class and ally with them. That is so in the UK in the 1800s all the way to the 1900s. But secondly, we don't think the bourgeoisie's benefit is just an issue of empathy. We think they bring practical benefits as well, in that these people become entrepreneurs, they open local businesses, ladies and gentlemen, they employ people, as such creating an economic multiplier effect that in the long run will lead to infant industries being created across different generations. And the third most important thing, something they've considered, is that at least we create a middle class in countries where there were no middle class to begin with because of the lack of FDI. We think that in and of itself is an invaluable benefit that we're very, very happy to stand behind. The last we want to look at are workers, ladies and gentlemen. On the first level, they've never dealt with what Iman said. That when these individuals are able to feed one more mouth in their family, even if they gain very, very low wages, at least 1 out of 10 kids may potentially go to school, at least 1 out of 10 kids can get an education, and across the next generation, break out of that cycle of poverty. It may be slow, it may be ugly, or we think it's good for these individuals on the ground, ladies and gentlemen, and that is exceedingly important. Secondly, we think this is extremely important as well. They say that they can just, these workers are inherently easy to substitute. And we fully agree, even under their context, these workers will be easy to substitute. And that is why we want to bring as many foreign companies, Chinese, MNCs, otherwise, into these countries to ensure that employment opportunities are as vast as possible, so as many people get employed as possible, ladies and gentlemen. That is fundamentally important. So, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, there's a very simple question you have to ask yourself. Given the context of governmental failure, of no comparative advantage, of an inability to do what they can to help people die on the streets, we think sweatshops are necessary evil because they're the one way these people can advance themselves, however much they may offend their first world sensibilities. On that count, ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to propose.
Thank you. Welcome to the next slide.
Madam Speaker, the affirmative in this debate are victims of the same pernicious neoliberal myth that has gripped the global economy over the last few decades. And that is, if you lock people into human misery, but give them a few dollars, that will transform like beans buried in the ground to liberty overnight, to freedom and dignity overnight, or even over the long term. We don't think that's happened. We think for decades, real wages of some workers in areas of China and Indonesia and sub-Saharan Africa have stalled and in some cases gone backwards. We haven't seen a resurgent international middle class that has been concerned about the proletarian brothers. They said on their side of the house that they were happy to still push governments. But the problem is, if you recognise that sweatshops are a necessity, you remove the strongest argument for change, because you allow people to continue to rely on the idea that this is the path to change when it's not. I have three questions. Number one, do they create jobs? Even if they do. Number two, do they aid development? And even if they do, number three, is it worth the human cost? To this first question about jobs, we told you the biggest problem at the moment that meant us that we bought this lie that you needed for people to suffer in order to give them jobs was a collective action problem. They offered a few objections. First of all, they said that you need to give these people terrible conditions in order to get investment in these countries. We said that you could have their conditions be so much better, but still be relatively a lot worse than the first world, which still gave a marginal incentive to transfer capital to the third world and transfer jobs there as well. What they said then at third was there are differences between developing countries, which is precisely why Elle said in her model that she would allow different conditions across different developing countries, but as a base standard she would allow for wages enough that you're not just a living wage or a survival wage, but second of all, that you provide people with shorter days with safe working conditions. What we think is likely to happen is that if the worst countries have those minimum conditions, that China won't then sell out on those countries, but will leverage those minimum standards to get even better conditions for those countries. So we buy the logic of the third affirmative that China has environmental and technological and social advantages over the worst developing states in the world. We think they can leverage that into getting even more extracted from multinational corporations, because the margins of profit on these units of labour are so astronomically high at the moment, they can cut and still be astronomically high in the long run. And we think that as such as relative differences occur, that will also lead to relative differences in standards. What we stood for in this debate was that that standard would always lie above the characterisation right at the beginning of the first affirmative speech of these miserable lives in sweatshops. The second they said is you can't possibly enforce this. We said that WTO enforcement had worked on things like child labour and chemicals, especially when other states will now have a political interest into ensuring that the developing states poorer than them don't break the international pact. But insofar as they do, if one state were to break the deal, we think that the fact that the majority of states would be continuing with this international norm makes it exceptionally hard to transfer at a fast rate your jobs to that single developing economy. But also, because we stand behind our side of the house, this is not a necessary form of development, and because we have the benefits of having some countries that have abandoned this system, the idea that this would be acceptable for multinational corporations to do would change. And that was Paul's argument, that we spur on the nascent demand of first world states for better conditions in the third world by rejecting the argument that's necessary. And insofar as that's true, say if Sudan was to break away from our international pact deal and multinational corporations were to move there, we think this would be rejected as an immoral move by the international community because we recognise this is not necessary. Let's look at those least powerful states they want to talk about. Finally, on this issue, we think that these least powerful states are the ones where you get the least amount of change from sweatshops, because the corrupt and terrible governments at the top of them take money from multinational corporations and support from multinational corporations such that they never evolve beyond the very worst conditions in those countries. And we think that that's problematic, because that level of corruption means that you don't get that liberal generation or that movement for change in those areas. Let's move on to development and whether we're going to achieve that. The problem with the neoliberal path to development is that we thought that ultimately, by buying into the logic of the opposition, that this was a necessary change, would give corporations, the state, and other members of these societies region to structure labour and capital such that change becomes impossible. Let's move through them in turn. First of all, to corporations. Under our system, we think that when China demands that because you're paying some workers in other countries slightly more, what they're going to demand in terms of what they're giving these corporations is educated workers, which means that foreign direct investment in these countries comes in the form of schools and hospitals to make those workers even more productive. And we think that's what happens, that at the top of the chain now of the developing world, because we push the whole standard up, that foreign direct investment comes in the form of enabling human labour rather than just enabling the transfer of products to the sea. Because we see that even if we could accept and understand that on our side of the house, that we reduce slightly foreign direct investment, we see this foreign direct investment serve the interests of corporate boards in New York and London and not the workers in the poorest societies in the world. What about transition? We thought the middle class they were relying on in the first speech of this debate were likely to transfer labour to people of their ethnic and religious group, more likely to consider the needs of men than women, and certainly more likely to consider the needs of their own class than the poorest people. What they thought on their side of the house, a third speaker, was that the middle class would become entrepreneurs and create even more jobs. What we did, by giving workers at the very bottom more disposable income, is give them the capacity as an investor class to create internal demand within that country. Because now they can afford not just to buy the food to keep them alive, but other important products, other important things that we think could also lead to capital accumulation from the bottom. But furthermore, we thought this entrepreneurial class is more likely created under our system, where the poorest people now have enough money to send their kids to school, because that's what the minimum wages have provided them with. And we think that what we do is you take away the argument from this middle class, even if they adopt this political consciousness, that they can offer to the state. Because you've embedded the idea that these things aren't necessary for human beings to have in terms of their inherent human dignity. But furthermore, what we did under our society was create a class of people who were healthy and educated. And even if there was an unemployed class below them, we thought they were the people that were going to mobilise to assist that unemployed class, because they were the ones with the closest experience to them in this side of the debate. We thought in the poorest states in the world, in the very worst states in the world, you weren't going to see changes in terms of that government happening, because what they did under their system was exacerbate the problems of crime. What they said under this is that crime happens in all society. That's true. But in our system, when wages are higher, the incentive to move to crime is less. Because in your society, when people are earning the basic subsistence wage, crime will be more profitable. But second of all, as Clark told you, the economic disparities that you create in your class, when you create this managerial, in your society, when you create this managerial society, are such that these people then functionally turn to crime against these people that have this property, and that further exacerbates the problems within these societies. Let's move to this final area of individual rights. Because even we recognise on this side of the house that some individuals as a result of this would be underemployed or less employed, though that we don't necessarily concede that, we still think this is important for these individuals. Because we think that often individuals that move into these employment jobs have been coerced by the state, who's in concert with global corporations, have adopted this paradigm of development, that we're not going to provide you with absolutely any assistance or human security unless you accept these unacceptable conditions. And we think often when they get into this path of accepting that myth, they actually go backwards in terms of their human development. They actually end up earning less. The middle class inflate the economy such that the small dollars they get aren't worth as much, because they fundamentally have a nutritional deficit because they're working so hard but don't necessarily get all the food or the major wages that they have, which is why suicide rates have increased so exponentially in these communities. What we thought was better was to create an international minimum standard so that these individuals could be the actual ones that mobilise the change the affirmative wanted to talk about, because they were the ones with the interest and the capacity now to create change within those governments, and certainly not the states themselves or the corporations that they were relying on their side of the house. We were so proud to oppose.
Thank you, and we move on to the reply speeches. That's all for the day.
Madam Speaker, what this debate came down to was a balance of options in the way we should approach change for sweatshops. The position of the affirmative team in today's debate was that we could afford to wait for change, but in the meantime pay people a very meagre subsistence wage. So we told you firstly on the negative team that there were 3 reasons why waiting for change wouldn't work. The first reason was all of the analysis we brought you about the problems stemming from that of collective action. We told you that you couldn't possibly depend upon individual countries to make this change, because that would remove their competitive advantage in a market that was built up against them. The second affirmative speaker was happy to depend upon countries like Indonesia making this change for themselves. But what they did was made the first mover risk in making this change much, much worse, because they, in acknowledging that it was necessary, removed the most poignant action for change at a collective level. Secondly, we told you that waiting for change in this debate wouldn't work, because the development would never increase to the extent that sweatshops would close, as the affirmative team tried to tell you. That was for a couple of reasons that I brought you in my speech. The first was that the type of subsistence wages that the affirmative team conceded these sweatshops paid didn't inject any money into the economy that would allow it to grow beyond the point of a subsistence wage paying. Secondly, that subsistence wages didn't allow for any investment in education. And finally, that people who worked in sweatshops had lower productivity at an economic level. Those three reasons were the reason why economic development would never occur to the extent that they would go beyond sweatshops, as the affirmative team tried to tell you. Thirdly, we told you that waiting wouldn't work, because the middle class they wanted to depend on to advocate this change wouldn't have the incentive to undermine their own creation of wealth that was built on these sweatshops, as we told you. But secondly, that the subsistence wage of the underclass would mean that there was no capital pressure from lower to actually make this change. So that brings us to the next question in the debate of whether or not the negative team was able to achieve change now. We told you that the international commitment to principles on child labour and hazardous chemicals in employment had worked, because international commitment had overcome collective action problems. Throughout their case, the affirmative never responded to the analogies of child labour and hazardous chemical materials. But the claims that they did make on why we wouldn't create this change were twofold. Firstly, that we couldn't create this change because we would lose foreign direct investment. We told you in my speech that profit on this labour was so high that even raising the standards with a commitment to this principle would still lead to more profit in developing industries, and that FDI would stay. But secondly, we told you that FDI purely for the purpose of these corporations was never going to be enough for the type of development the affirmative team envisaged. Their second claim on why the negative team couldn't get change now was that came most clearly at third affirmative, where they said that someone would always break this deal and that companies would move to those most lax jurisdictions. We gave you two responses to that even. The first was that when you had collective action on this issue, there would be a political interest in enforcing that collective principle. I gave you the example in my speech of cross-border policing on child labour. But secondly, we told you in Paul's substantive that changing the international norm for consumers that said that sweatshops were okay would mean that the consumer cost to corporations moving to the one jurisdiction where this was still allowed would be too great that they wouldn't consider it. The final question was, even if we were to wait, what was the human cost? The affirmative team conceded a lot of this human cost, but said it was okay to wait. We never thought that that was sufficient to justify the human misery that both teams acknowledged in today's debate. We told you that we couldn't wait, that we could act now, and that the human misery was so great that we should act now, and that's why the negative team won this debate.
Thank you, Class Leader Debate.
The Bangladeshi government can be seen as progressive by any means and by any standards. They've instituted things, for example, quota for women in parliament and stuffer laws. They've instituted things, for example, limited education grants to help better the lot of the people. Unfortunately, the Bangladeshi government doesn't possess the economic and financial wherewithal to provide decent employment with decent standards for the people of Bangladesh, more than 50% of whom live below the poverty line. Behind the reality, with the reality of that context in mind, we make the argument, Madam Speaker, that sweatshops are of fundamental importance to these people. Like in his harangue against Liberty Beans, right? What Daniel highlighted for us was this idea that in most instances, countries tend to retrograde in terms of economic development and fall back into utter devastation. It is in that hopelessness, Madam Speaker, that we ground our points. The first point I'm going to look at and analyze, like really just prove to you why we won, was this idea of collective action, right? And basically everything is contingent on that idea, that because it's a feasible option to employ, therefore it means sweatshops are inherently unnecessary. Of course, collective action will solve all the problems in the world. Collective action will solve climate change, it will solve AIDS, it will solve even child trafficking. But the simple fact of the matter, and none of them ever proved, was why that was possible in this instance, and they never responded to the nuances coming from in our substantive points. Like, we've argued three primary responses. Firstly, this is not going to happen, no cooperation is going to happen between countries because they are naturally hostile against one another in their competition for limited economic investment and economic resources. China is not going to give in and allow you to be in concert with your economic cooperation by any standards. The second response that we gave was that it only takes one company that was willing to weather the international criticism that's going to be leveled against them to break that cooperation that will lead to the kind of downslide which makes and actualizes, in fact, the necessity and the fundamental importance of having sweatshops in the first place. Again, never responded by the other side. We even further sweetened the deal with a third response, that even if you are able to establish some form of cooperation and some of action in concert to help these people, like we've proven to you that the standards are going to be employed are primarily going to be standards imposed by first world lobbies which we think are incompatible with the conditions in these countries. We've given you examples of how, for example, the fair trade movement basically led to the isolation of things like banana farmers and coffee bean growers in Mexico. Again, never responded to by any of the speakers. Then they went on this little highfalutin concept, right? Like I thought was just completely ridiculous. The idea, the moment you have this, becomes a self-justifying cause. It is disingenuous to expect us to say that sweatshops will provide incentive for change, and we never claim that. In fact, any incentive for change should happen independent of that if it's inherent in the will of the democratic government itself. Like, even if we were to take the context where these governments are so corrupted and take money and pilfer money from these multinational corporations, what we suggest here is that is where it becomes so fundamental importance. In that lacuna where no pressure is able to be enforced on these multinational corporations, where these governments lack the kind of political clout, we think sweatshops play a fundamental role. Which brings me to the second idea, the second huge contention in this debate. The tangible benefits and the tangible effects. The only things that you could say is that, when it comes to sweatshops, you can easily substitute people and you can never spend on anything meaningful. The fact that people are there to substitute one for another shows someone is being employed, and that is an option that we think, at the very least, benefits these people. The fact that it is everywhere, the fact that it's ensuring some level of employment was of fundamental importance. And we argued that without that option, they will fall into the informal sector. They will be involved in things like prostitution. They'll be involved in things like, for example, narco trafficking, which we think, and unlike what Paul said, is a fate worse than what you find in these companies, and something that we are proud to stand by. They never once addressed the idea that combating poverty was not an immediate quick fix solution. It's an intergenerational kind of concerted effort that has to come in, fire these fragile gains that we are able to make. They never responded to the idea about how we are actually creating a middle class. Madam Speaker, it is clear, this important motion must stand and still does.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks. Yes. On camera. I ran out of water as well.